Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to another one of my shows with me, William Wallace for America. With me today is Mike Hambrick. I'm going to bring you on in just a second, Mike, but everybody, this is going to be not only a very interesting video if you're watching it on Cloud Hub or on Rumble or on any of my video platforms, but you're going to also, what you're going to do is you're going to see it here on any podcast app. So I'm on all major podcast apps. Please share it with your friends. And before we get started, remember that My Pillow has been kind enough to sponsor my show. And if you go to mypillow.com and use promo code WWFA, or if you believe in the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, pro-life, military, the founding fathers, you'll like Patriot Mobile. Go to Patriot Mobile. You go to www.patriotmobile.com/WWFA. Same promo code for My Pillow. Mike, thank you so much for coming on today.
William, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Well, I got to tell you, when I started reading your bio, I said, we've got either 3 or 4 shows or a really good hour that I think everybody is really, really, really going to enjoy, for this. So,
well, I hope so. That would be interesting. That'd be fun.
I think so too. Well, Mike, tell us a little bit about yourself before we get to talk about your book there.
Well, my background is in television news journalism. I was a TV news anchor, reporter, producer, news manager, and for the better part of 40 years. I go all the way back to film days, William, and all the way through to live and digital. So I spent the last 20 some odd years of my career in Washington, D.C. And before that, I was in Baltimore and Phoenix, Dallas, Fort Worth, Pittsburgh. So I kind of traveled. I was I guess a media wanderer for a while, but I came across some really interesting people, some great stories, had just what I thought was a real fun and interesting, challenging career. But I always was in television most of the time, but I started early on in radio when I was just a kid in a small town in Northeast Texas, Greenville, Texas. I was a rock and roll DJ, started when I was like 17 years old.
You're telling your age, Mike. Come on.
Well, it's hard to hide it, William. No, I'm just glad to be here. I tell you, one of the things that might be interesting to talk about, you decide, is I went through an amazing, difficult, pretty much unprecedented battle with COVID pneumonia.
I didn't even know this.
Yeah.
I want to start talking about your book and your the attack on our foundations of Western civilization. But let's get that out of the way real quick.
Well, just to start off with a little perspective, this time, a year ago last month, I was not able to walk. I was hospitalized with COVID for 4 months, was intubated twice, was on dialysis, blood transfusions, 3 heart pressors, oxygen, of course, and I actually died. I flatlined.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Oh, this is all from COVID.
COVID. Well, it was COVID and COVID pneumonia, and that's a whole different thing than just someone having COVID nowadays, COVID-19. And the pneumonia was the near killer. I mean, and I have to say, I had the doctors cannot explain, William, why I lived. In fact, they were trying to convince every day my fiance and my children to just let me go. They were saying that I was going to have, that I would be, if I lived at all, I would be a vegetable. I wouldn't have any quality of life, and I would certainly be on oxygen for the rest of my life. And they were just saying, let him go. Well, everyone who knew me knew that they felt like they had me identified as a fighter and that I was not going to give up, and they didn't give up on me. And there were thousands of people, I have to say, around the country, William, that were praying for me, fervent prayers constantly. And I know that made a huge difference. As I
Mhm.
say, the doctors they, they called me the miracle man because I mean, when you go through 2 intubations, 3 heart pressors, I mean, every organ in my body except uh, uh, my I guess my brain had failed, and but I was also in induced coma, and I was in and out of comas, but I had what was a divine experience, William, and I think that a divine intervention that absolutely. I mean, I'm a person of faith, and I have been, but this intervention and communication took me to a whole different level of in my spiritual journey, and I'm so blessed to actually have experienced that. I think
So,
it was
so when I look at your path as a journalist and some of the stories that we're going to talk about in this interview, and where you are right now, and kind of what you've been through, it's almost like there was a hurdle put up and you were brought over the hurdle, in your opinion, and mine too, for that matter, by divine intervention. I would have to agree with you on that. To tell the stories of not only you're going to tell about some of your journalist stories that you're going to share with us, but also you're going to talk about how the socialist revolution is to destroy the 4 foundations of Western civilization, and maybe that divine intervention helps you do your part to motivate some people to save our country.
well, that would be a wonderful task to be a part of, and I do believe, with all degree of humbleness, that I was saved for a reason. I think a lot of people are at times, and I keep looking for and being vulnerable to listen to God and say, okay, what is it? What is my mission now? Why did you save me, Lord? Thank you so much, but why did you? And you may be right, and this may be the beginning of that process. However, prior to COVID, and it also COVID sidelined, as you can imagine, several things that I was doing at the time in my life. And one of them, I had just formed a nonprofit foundation called Save America's Freedom Foundation. And it is political, but it's also faith based as well. I believe, and it's hard to deny if you really do your research in the history of this country, that this country is a Christian country. It was based on
Mhm.
Judeo-Christian values. The founding fathers communicated about that in all the letters and communication. I think that our Constitution reflects that, and I just believe that this country is here for a reason, and I think it is now under threat. I think that the you call them progressives, socialists, radical Democrats, whatever.
Mhm.
I call them socialist, and of course, I think socialism is just a speed bump to communism. So, and and I believe that it's not an overstatement. And let me qualify this by saying I'm not some right wing crazo wingnut, alt right sort of person. I have done a lot of research and study on where I think we are in this country and how we got here. And that was the work that I did on that led to the starting of the foundation.
Right.
But I really did come as a journalist. I witnessed all of the things that were going on in the country and wondering why the attack on freedom, the attack on the Constitution, the attack on all things that made Western civilization great. Why were all these things happening? What? And I determined that they weren't the problems; they were the symptoms of the
Yeah.
problem and symptoms of the disease. And I identified in my mind the disease is socialism. And I think if you check a lot of the boxes of what is a socialist government, that America qualifies. Now, there's this hybrid that is not just in this country, but in a lot of countries, of socialist slash capitalism. And I think that's in a large way where we are today in America. Um, a lot of people are asking, and I hear people talking about it and have conversations with people, is conservatism really still with us? Is it alive? And
I tell people that conservatism doesn't know a party. It doesn't know a race, a gender. It has no boundaries. And what I'm upset with about the Republican Party is that they stole the word conservatism to mean something Republican when the fact is conservatism actually unites more people in our country than Republican values or Democrat values. I think conservatism is more of a thread that ties more people together than we realize.
I agree with you 100%, William. I think that what has happened is, in the language of politics, and when I just parenthetically here, when I left traditional broadcasting, I went to work in politics. I worked on the Hill, was communications consultant to several members of Congress. I ran political campaigns, statewide gubernatorial campaigns.
Right.
So I really got into the political process. But I think that in politics, there has to be a language of action. And so I think as a result of that, the political conversation as it relates to conservatism has now devolved to just free market economy discussions. Everything is in the economic language.
Right.
And we've lost sight of what true conservative, what classical conservatism really is. Yes, it's a free market economy, but it's also all about all of the wonderful things that came about in Western civilization that form the tissue, the strain that keeps us all together. And those are aesthetic things. Those are literature, art, architecture, the wonderful things of
Those,
Western
those are all the,
civilization.
those are all the things that make people think creatively and think in such a way that they think for themselves. And those are the things that make people, when you think for yourself, you become personally responsible.
And
You
free.
and free, and you believe, and you crave that freedom and liberty from those types of aspects or those types of things like you just mentioned, in such a way that the ideologies and the narratives that are being used to divide us become something that we are more aware of. And I think that part of that being removed from our society is also an attack on education, for the reason we just talked about, to make it easy for socialism to have their revolution to destroy the foundations of our Western civilization, as you like to mention. Do you
You,
agree?
I, we're on the same page, brother. Exactly. I see. I think that the socialist slash progressives, however you want to define them, that 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 political class, they've taken control of all levers of power and influence, by and large, in this country. That's education, news and information, culture through movies and TV shows and series and cartoons and all that kind of stuff. They've taken control of this country politically,
Right.
and they've taken control of the economy as well. Unlike the historical examples of socialism, communism, where the ruling class goes in and just nationalizes and takes over businesses, these people that started this political cultural revolution, and I track it all the way back to around the beginning, early 1900s is when it really started moving with some degree of direction and an intellectual power force behind it. It was roughly around 1902. But they realized that America was unique and different, and they couldn't. This was not going to be a bloody coup, a war.
Right.
This is going to be an intellectual political revolution, and they were prepared to spend and be patient and spend the necessary time to do it in a peaceful way. And they're very smart people, they're very relentless, and they have been successful because they've changed the nature of everything in this country by taking control of
Mhm.
all these levers of power. And that includes, of course, education. And I think you were right when you said a while ago, we as a country, as a culture, as members of this culture, have been dumbed down to where we have no historical perspectives, we have no historical moorings, and that's all by design. So people are easily moved. H.L. Mencken, I think, referred to the to much of America as the bewildered herd. And I think that's what's happened, and it is by design. You've seen these as these sound bites and from people on the street saying, who is Winston Churchill, or what capital of the country is this, and they they don't know.
Right, exactly.
They're not taught that. I remember back in the late 80s, William Bennett, who was the education secretary under Ronald Reagan,
Remember that, right?
was debating the president of Stanford on the Stanford campus of whether or not Western civilization should be part of the curriculum at Stanford. And the chant in the halls and in the parking lot, the chant was, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go." And regrettably, Bill Bennett lost that debate, and Western civilization is still taught at Stanford, but it's taught in a way that all members of Western civilization were, in essence, oppressors. And that all of the things that we hold near and dear and are unique in the human experience, totally unique. I mean, Western civilization is the greatest thing that's ever happened on
Absolutely.
this planet, save the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. I mean, it's the greatest civilization ever. Were there problems? Have there been problems? Have we overcome problems? Yes, of course.
If you look at one of our biggest problems, they like to bring up a lot and to prove to use as their proof that we're oppressors is slavery.
Yes.
But the reality is, America was one of the newest countries to ever have slavery. Or one of the more recent at those times. There had been slavery in existence for hundreds of years, if not thousands of years before that. But America was the first one to end it. And in today's times, there are more people in slavery today in other countries than there ever was in America. And the other thing I like to bring up too, as part of my history, is people like to talk about the founding fathers. They wrote the Constitution and the 3/5 clause, but the reality is the founding fathers were born into slavery. They themselves were born in America hundreds of years after slavery was started here in America, and so they were born into families that owned slaves. So, but if you look at the Constitution, when they wrote the Constitution, they laid the stepping stones, the groundwork to be able to end slavery.
Right.
Maybe not in their time, but they put the groundwork in there and the wording for it also.
Right. And it was and is a black mark on America. There's no question about it. But the key phrase is it's no longer there. It was a black mark. It is a black mark, but it no longer exists. And we need to move on from that. Now, there's still, there's always improvement in all areas of culture that can continually be made. But I maintain that if you look at the historical script for socialism, minorities and people are usually not treated too well under socialist governments.
Well, and that's the thing.
And-
Today's the narratives and the ideologies are trying to make more people want socialism, but in the end result, those same people being used to usher it in are going to be the people that are affected the worst.
Right. That's historically true. But once again, we're our educational system, particularly at colleges and universities, does not teach that, and so we lose that historical perspective, and the conversation. One of the things, as I mentioned earlier, the the political dialogue, the political vocabulary is purely economic primarily, because that's easy to talk about. That's easy also to attack.
Right.
It's hard for the socialists to attack and to corral faith, spirit, creativity, ideas of freedom, the concept of freedom, which is classical conservatism. See, I really do believe in the hearts of most of us, we are conservatives. Uh, we get lost in the political claptrap of everything
Exactly
that
right.
goes on,
Exactly
but
right. The
but
narrative of it.
we want to take care of our families. We want to conserve them. We want to conserve a quality of life. We are just being led astray, thinking it's real easy for socialists to sell utopia, and it's an action movement kind of thing. Follow me, I'm going to set you free. Follow me, I'm going to give you a better life. Rather than conservatives would their mantra on the street would be, let's wait a minute, hesitate here a
So
second,
it's
let's
funny,
think about this, right?
Mike. It's funny is it's something you're describing, and you've made me think about here is conservatism is almost like having another conscience on you. So when your conscience tells you something's wrong, something's not right, conservatism also does the same thing, not morally as much as, and not even really financially is too specific, but conservatism is almost like another conscious for a way of living, in with your freedom or using your freedom and using your liberty in such a way that you want to do the right thing with it. And you're correct. While some people are following the narratives and the ideologies, many conservatives that are aware that they're conservatives or wear that conservative badge or wave that conservative flag, are more aware and say, wait a second. But even the people who are Democrats or people that align themselves as a liberal or slightly left of center, the ones that I have met that are more conservative than some of my friends who think they're conservative, even some of them are like, hey, wait a minute, this national debt is getting kind of big. So it's almost like another conscience, if you will. But Mike, before we get too far off, I want to talk about some specific things about you because, and we can blend some of this in more as we go because I can see we're going to have a good conversation here. Is what is your organization, Save America's Freedom? What is it you do?
Well, as I say, we've been sidelined because of COVID, and I've yet to really get back and engage in that because I just finished. I was in the process of writing my first novel, and so I finished that. But uh, Save America's Freedom Foundation was was formed out of the conversation and discussion of the things that we're talking about right here and now, William, and all of these things that we hold near and dear and are under tremendous strain and threat now. So the idea of Save America's Freedom Foundation, Save America's Freedom, was unnatural to me as I analyzed, in my humble way, as I say, the symptoms, and then got to the disease, which is socialism. This foundation was formed to do its little part, to the degree that I'm successful in doing anything, to bring attention to the things that we're talking about here. Also, show people how we got here, and they're not being taught that in colleges and universities today. So it's an educational thing. It is a spiritual concept, and it's political. It's all of those wrapped into one. I was on before COVID. Everything in my life is BC and AC, before COVID and after COVID.
Right.
But before COVID, I was on a kind of a speaking tour in the southeast and southwest, and I came across this large group of people, and they invited me to one of their conferences of ministers and preachers whose purpose is to convince fellow ministers around the country that it is past time, that politics needs to re-enter the pulpit. If you go back to the history of the revolution in this country, William, that I'm sure you have,
Hmm.
before there was one shot fired, before there was any idea of a violent revolution, the idea and the fervor and the essence of the revolution started in the cauldron of the pulpit in churches
Exactly
in
right.
in this country. And of course, see, once again, these people are very smart and they're very sly. They said, okay, churches, if you want to keep your nonprofit found, we'll give you a nonprofit tax affiliation certification as long as you don't mention politics in your religion. Once you start doing that, we're going to take away your 501c3 status, tax exempt status. Well, these ministers are saying, listen, if you adhere to that pressure and to that game, you're whistling past the graveyard, because eventually, if it keeps going this way, if you don't take action,
Right.
if politics doesn't re-enter the pulpit, there's not going to be any pulpit around to re-enter. Your church is going to go away, because that's the first thing that socialists go after. And by definition,
It's almost
socialists are atheists.
like we're talking about, when people who go to church, and I'm being very generalizing here. People who go to church tend to have a moral foundation, a conscious foundation of what's going on. Not the people who don't go to church don't, but up and up, in those times, those are very passionate people. People go to church, or people who have faith. People who have a deep-seated faith tend to be very passionate about their beliefs. That's probably the right way to say it, is not that they're going to church, but people who have faith tend to be people who are passionate about their core beliefs, their conservative values, their family values, their country. And an attack on the church is an attack on our freedoms and liberties in our country.
Well, we got all of, our value system in this country emanates from religion, from Christianity. One of the basic tenets, as we all know, and imagine, it sounds pretty, um, I guess, naive and quixotic, but if we just adhered to one of the basic tenets of Christianity, in Christ's words of "do unto others as you would have them do unto you," if we did that in everything that we did, think about how much better this country would be, and we wouldn't be suffering under what we're suffering under today. But what has happened is, and this is all part of that design of the socialist movement, part of it is moral relativism. And what is that? What is moral relativism? Now, it's got a lot of definitions, but one of them is it's what you are left with when you move away from traditional Christian moral values. And that's what this country has done. Once again, religion has been ridiculed, marginalized, demonized, and basically uh, destroyed. In not just in this country. If there was a recent story, it was in the Washington Post this last week, of a survey taken in the United Kingdom, that 65% of the people don't in the UK now do not identify as Christians.
Hmm.
65%.
Well, that's amazing.
Oh, I know, but that's what's happened. Part of that, I think, is because of their immigration policies. There was some concern about how the Western world, Christian world, would deal with the Islamic world. And in the discussion before there was the total cauldron and problems and disruption in the Middle East, which caused huge migrations of Islam Muslims to other parts of the world. We were kind of just existing with them. Now they're in our Western cultures and our Western environment, and they're using our freedoms to destroy our freedom.
Wow.
It's Islam, and I know I'm going to probably make some real enemies here. It's not just a religion. It is a way of living, and it is political. It is a government, if you will, and it doesn't have any leeway or sympathy for infidels, people who do not become Muslims. I mean, that's in the Quran. That is part of the deal.
What's interesting here now, Michael, that you're touching on, is that the religion of Islam, you're saying, wraps up politics into religion, and it's something that in America, Christianity is not allowed to do. Christianity is not allowed to wrap its politics up into religion or politics into religion because they've tied it to money, so they lose their 501c3. It's almost like you can look at how Christianity is being dismantled in America in the churches because politics is destroying a lot of the things that Christians live by, but yet they can't fight back because then they lose their funding, and they don't want to bring they can't bring politics into it, where America is more forgiving or tolerant of Islam wrapping politics up into its religion. But
Right.
I wonder if mosques lose their 501c3 if they talk politics.
I don't see how they can't, but once again, generally those their meetings and their worship services are not usually open to the public, so much of the time. So we don't really know what goes on in the madrasas and the schools and the Muslim organizations. One of the things also I think we need to clarify here too, William, is the myth around the so-called separation of church and state in this country. Now, the socialists, the progressives, the postmodernists, the political elites, if you will, have defined that as there's no room for God in our government. They've taken prayer out of schools. They've done, all kinds of measures to, once again, marginalize religion in this country. The truth of it is that the idea of separation of church and state was designed by the founders to prohibit what happened in the Church of England,
Mm-hmm.
In the UK, that there was only one religion that you could be a part of, and so designated by the government. That's not what's happening here.
Right. The separation of church and state was not that we can't have religion in our government. It was that they did not want there to be a state-sponsored, mandated religion is how that's supposed to be.
Exactly. But that's been turned around, and they've done little things that seem minor, but they have, I think, a huge impact. The idea, where did it come from? Certainly, it was not a part of traditional America, that you don't talk about religion and politics in a social gathering. That's taboo. That's, you're being a bore if you do
Right.
that. That is by design.
Right.
To keep people from exchanging ideas and concept and talking about what goes on. They're not being socially correct by talking. So those ideas are not discussed. I mean, it's all about keeping people ignorant, unaware, not tuned in, all the while they're over here eradicating and chewing up your way of life and your freedoms and the things that we hold dear as Americans. And that's what that's what America, Save America's Freedom Foundation is about. It's it's to enlighten people, if I may say so, an effort to enlighten people and to make them aware of these issues, because I believe that most Americans don't want to lose their freedoms.
Absolutely not. They don't. But America. What's interesting is Americans don't want to lose their freedoms, but they don't disassociate their freedoms from the narratives and ideologies. Instead, they adhere to the narratives and ideologies that are separating us from our freedoms, but they don't realize it. It's kind of a unique twist. They don't see that in order to maintain their freedom and liberty, they have to disassociate themselves from those narratives that they're being told we need to be able to have our freedoms, i.e., when you hear about we'll just say, gay marriages, for instance. If you don't believe in that, you're going to lose your freedom. When the opposite is true, if you adhere to the narratives, you're going to give up other freedoms without even realizing it, because you're so focused on what they're telling you to be focused on instead of focusing on adhering to your freedom and liberty otherwise.
I agree with that. I think all of that, if you look at it, is by design, in order to create a divisive and environment and pit people against people, instead of finding areas of agreement and moving on and conserving what we have. It's all about destroying what we have. And so all of these isms are being created and fomented by a relative minority group of people that are very politically active, very vocal, and they understand the use of the media, and the mainstream media, which I worked in for 40 years,
We're going to talk about that here in a second.
is
So
is I mean, they're part of their um, they're part of the deal as far as the progressive movement is concerned. They're the megaphone for the progressives, socialists in this country.
Mike, are we winning
No,
or losing the war?
that's my humble opinion. Now, that's not to say we can't win it, but there are so many things that we have. See, conservatives by nature have been kind of, through the years, a laissez-faire group of people. You know, we go along, we're going to work hard, keep our nose to the grindstone, pay our mortgage, put our kids through college. We're going to enjoy our life and conserve what we value. And we're not activist in the street people. And those people have taken control. They've used that against us. So the other thing that has happened in this vacuum that's been created, it's a vacuum by nature, tries to get filled, I think. And I think that you touched on it earlier, that conservatism is an entity over here in itself, and then all of this political stuff going on around us, kind of in the name of conservatives, if it helps bring more people under the tent. But this whole anger and enemy, and just there's no compromise, there's no discussion, there's no. I'm starting working on, just if I may say so, um, a podcast myself with him, and that I've been writing and getting ready to produce, called "Above the Noise" is the title of it. And the concept is to wait a minute. We need to talk here, people. We don't need to yell and scream at each other and have all this anger and vitriol and name calling, and we have to come together over something. We can't, or they're going to win. They're going to win.
But the problem that I see, Mike, is that in general, most conservatives are libertarian minded politically at heart. While that's why I get angry that the Republican Party, or many aspects of the Republican Party, or many sects of the Republican Party, have stolen the word conservatism. as a way to say it is republicanism. I know I brought this up earlier, but the reality is, I find that most people are conservative are also libertarian minded at heart, and they kind of want to be left alone, independent, self-reliant, self-respect, thin for themselves, peaceful kind of minded people. Again, it's a different kind of conscience on their mind, that they want to be able to, get everybody to kind of get along, if you will. I
Yeah.
The conservatives are
Pardon me.
the near dwellers, or the rabble rousers of the right. They're actually more of the centrist of both parties, because again, there's a lot of Democrats who are more conservative minded. But the problem is, it's almost like we got to take the conservative people and say, look, it's time to wake up, whether you're Democrat, Republican, libertarian minded. Our conservative values are under attack. And while I would agree with you a little bit that we are losing, I'm more optimistic that we win in the end. Right now, we're losing, but I think in the end we win.
I think so. I think ultimately, I have to think that, or you just fold up the tent and go home.
But I look at you, Mike, and I go, you used to be a part of the media, which I want you to share some of our stories. And I don't know how much time I'm gonna have you for tonight, but we've been on there for about 40 minutes already.
Oh wow,
Time flies when we're having
doesn't it?
fun, right?
Yeah, right.
But you look like you say you've been part of the media. You've got a lot of stories to share with us. But having been in the media, though, aren't you one of those guys creating the narratives and the ideologies? Or do I just assume, in a very kind-hearted way, by looking at you, that you're one of the old school journalists back in the day, when journalists took pride in journalism, and reporting is as it is, without coloring it up with narratives and ideologies?
Okay, let's look at that a second. And I understand and I appreciate what you're saying. But back in the day, as you reference it, before cable news, before conservative talk radio, before Rush Limbaugh, before Sean Hannity, before Tucker Carlson, before that whole conservative movement that actually saved AM radio, that I think by and large Rush Limbaugh will get the credit or blame for, depending on your point of view. I happen to say credit. Um, Back in the day before that, we didn't have anything to compare the news to. It was CBS, ABC, and NBC. Walter Cronkite, Huntley Brinkley, and the ABC people, which started as kind of a 15-minute newscast early on, and then progressed to mainstream. But it all came on at 6 o'clock roughly, and that was it. That was the news of the day, and the newspapers, which had a lot more influence than they do today. So we didn't have any the news as it was being reported by those three networks. We didn't have anything to compare it to. There wasn't another side that was challenging what was being reported. And to those that were challenging it in the streets, they were once again, molded and identified the way the media wanted to identify them. It was then we had the revolution, the '60s revolution, which is part of what my novel is about. And then we had the technological revolution that just blew everything apart. And so now we have camps of the media that says, okay, we've carved out this audience and we're going to roll around in that echo chamber because that's going to give us ratings and we'll be able to sell advertising dollars. Don't forget, that's what the medium is all about, is advertising. And whatever works that creates ratings that they can sell sell advertising, that's what's going to be there. So they carved out an audience, and just Fox has an audience, MSNBC has an audience, and CNN has an audience. and they preach this. It's the same script every night, and nothing really changes. They're rolling around in their own echo chamber. They marginalize and criticize, and that's where all that vitriol and hatred and
Exactly.
and that's why I'm saying we need to have, I try not to have any hubris in doing this, but above the noise. Let's get rid of the noise and have a conversation here that reaches some degree of comedy between people and an understanding and an exchange of ideas. And I think if there's an honest exchange of ideas, the truth will win out. And the truth is, classical conservatism, Western civilization, is the greatest thing that's happened since the scissors. Okay. And
But maybe.
so the truth will win out in an honest exchange of ideas. Because tell me where socialism has worked. It's like Margaret Thatcher said, socialism is great until you run out of money.
So I want to cover some of your stories, and I could talk this all day. We're going to have to do some more talk about this too down the road. Mike, I could
love
see
to
you on again. But you've got an interesting story. Are you writing a book and you have a story on the Martin Luther King saga that you said you were a part of in such a way?
Yeah, I just finished, and it's about to go up on Amazon, and the name of the book is Memphis. And it's fiction, and you don't write fiction, William, as you know, without it being semi-autobiographical.
Right.
And this certainly is. But it's also, I took the liberty of that fiction does to be creative, and it's historical fiction to some degree. And it's loosely based on someone not unlike me. And I knew I was going to write. It's the first of two books. Mm-hmm. And I was writing, just to give you a little bit of history, I was writing what was now the second book I was writing first. It was called Dance with the Devil. And it was about current Washington corruption, narco-terrorism, all of the things that go on, some of which I reported on, was a part of, some of which I felt the brunt of from the powers that be, I personally felt. So it was all a part of Dance with the Devil. Mm-hmm. Then I also do some acting, and I had my acting manager at the time said she knew my history as a rock and roll DJ and working in different markets around the country. And she said, that's got to be your first book. You got to write that book first. Took some convincing, but I finally pulled away from Dance with the Devil and started writing Memphis. Well, I was in Memphis when Martin Luther King was killed. I was there in 1968. And I knew that I was going to have to, in some way, when I started writing this book, was going to have to deal with that event. And I didn't know quite exactly how I was going to do it when I started writing it, because it was basically the history of the blues coming out of the Mississippi Delta and how the Memphis sound and all that kind of stuff. But I obviously needed more to it than that. Mm-hmm. And so when I started doing the research on all of the various conspiracies around the assassination of Martin Luther King, I came across some people who were very diligent and committed for 45 years of not turning loose of the conspiracies that I think were indeed true. In fact, as a result of some of those efforts, Coretta Scott King, before she passed, openly, publicly said that she did not think that James Earl Ray shot her husband, that she believed that it was a government conspiracy at the highest levels, and that's as far as she went. I think she knew a lot more than that, because she was dealing with some of the same people that I've talked to and read and researched, and came up with this whole conspiracy theory that ends up driving the book. Mm-hmm. With the blues and soul and rhythm and blues and rock and roll playing in the background.
Right, exactly. This is
So,
this will be some interesting stuff. When is that book coming out?
well, it should be any moment now that we're going to put it up on Amazon. It's going to be published by Amazon,
Maybe
and
that'll be our next interview. We just talk just about that book.
well, that'd be great. I'd love to do that. That'd be wonderful.
So what other unique stories do you have as a journalist that you covered? Do you have any other unique stories from your time as a journalist that were memorable for some people, that maybe have influenced your life in such a way, that's where you are now with your foundation and with this book you're writing?
Absolutely. I think that we're all a sum total of our life experiences, and I certainly am. I would quick to point out that I've had an undeservedly interesting life. I mean, I was just a ragtail kid that grew up in East Texas oil field towns. Okay, I never thought for an instant that I would be covering presidential campaigns, wars, corruption, all that kind of stuff, and that I would ever have the opportunity to do that. And I'm so blessed, and it was just, you know, it was wonderful for me. It was I grew up in Mount Vernon, Texas, town of 1,500 people, right? The claim to fame was it was the home of Don Meredith, the first quarterback for the Dallas Cowboys. But he was an All-American at SMU. Anyway, so I feel very fortunate, extremely fortunate, totally fortunate to have done that. But yeah, I mean, I was in Bosnia. I covered the war in Bosnia. I was in the former Soviet Union when Boris Yeltsin had his first constitutional crisis. I watched that, was there for that meltdown. Um, yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess I covered every presidential campaign up to George W. Bush's first one. And I've interviewed presidents, and I've done all that stuff. I was just so fortunate. But it did mold me, and it made a difference, and I grew in it. It afforded me the opportunity to and pressured me into developing some kind of an awareness and a worldview of what was going on, rather than just reading a teleprompter. And to the degree that I could do that, I did, and I have, and I continue to do it. I continue to be, I always said, a student as well as a participant
Hmm.
of what's going on, and it has led me um, to where I am today. And I was in a relatively unique position to observe events, and by observing them in reality, there was a real I started questioning more from a more realistic way of what's going on. That's what I was saying earlier. I kept saying, why is all this stuff happening? Why this can't just be, something that just poof happens. There's something driving this. There's something driving us toward in this direction as a country. And that's what I did my 2.5 years of research uh, before I formed Save America's Freedom Foundation.
So how many years were you a journalist?
Oh,
You still are a journalist essentially, but
yeah.
you know,
The better part, I was in broadcast media the better part of 40 years.
so
Uh,
that
I
kind of molded you to make you more aware, being a journalist in the big markets, in working for the big guys that we now know are creating narratives and pushing ideologies, but in your having conservative values in your heart, having the American spirit, the love of country in your heart has been helped shape you to where you see now what was going on behind the scenes in such a way that it's propelling you to have your Save America Foundation, to be able to, Save America, Save America's Freedom Foundation, rather, in such a way that you're using that knowledge, that institutional knowledge, if you will, that time in service of the big, media companies to say, hey, this is what's going on. Here's what we need to do. We're losing this. We need to wake up.
Yeah, and you're right. And I say that in all humbleness. To the degree that I'm capable of doing that, that's what I'm trying to do. But one of the things that I think that, to put an exclamation point behind what you're saying, I was still in traditional broadcast media long enough to witness the the influx, the infiltration of community organizers into the management of news departments and into the editorial decision-making process, which totally turned the the concept of traditional journalism on its ear. It all became for the cause. It all became a political instrument.
When do you think that happened? When do you think that turn of events happened? At what point? And how did you recognize it as being, wow, this is something that's going to change journalism for the future of America?
Well, I recognized it, I guess, in the mid '90s and forward. Um, in editorial meetings, it became not reporting on what was happening, but it was reporting on what could happen as a result of what is happening. And then we made stories out of, or they did, about what could happen. Well, it hasn't happened, but it could happen. So
Happen. And if you
yeah,
believe in this, it might happen worse.
yeah, but what they wanted to do by what could happen fit their narrative of a socialist movement.
Mhm.
And the whole community organizer mentality was at play, except they had a much larger megaphone to use. They infiltrated it. And the mainstream media is primarily guided by liberal intellectual people. Uh, and it has been for a long time. Once again, back in the day, as we refer to it, there was no alternative. That whatever Walter Cronkite said, or whatever Huntley Brinkley said, uh, we thought was okay. That's probably true, right? There was no one thought about coming from a point of view or having a media leftist bias.
Mhm.
But I think and the media has always been involved. Look at William Randolph Hearst. He caused the Spanish American War. Come on. Yeah. They've always been a, a, an instrument of influence. It's rarely, objectivity is like beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder. And I've tested that. I did it a lot. I also had a talk radio program and some syndicated radio shows as well. But I would say things and I'd get all of this affirmation, the blinking lights would happen, and people would agree with, that's right, that's right. And then the next night I would say the same thing, but coming from a different point of view, and I got a whole different set of people lighting up saying, yeah, you're right, you're so correct, you're so non-biased, you're so middle of the road, because I was saying something that they agreed with. So
Right.
uh, there is no such thing as objectivity when it comes to reporting, and we all bring a bias.
Were there any stories that you covered back? You said you saw this turn in the early '90s. Was there any particular story that you can think of in the newsroom, as you pointed out, in the editorial room, as you pointed out, that was a trigger for you, that you went, wow, this is going to be the start of something really bad?
Yeah, it was when the contract with America, the Republican Revolution in 93, 94. the results of the Republicans taking control of the House for the first time in 30 years, I had become more of a concern. I was the odd person out in the newsroom, and people knew it. I was becoming more and more vocal in my conservative positions, and so I had developed some contacts within the conservative Republican community, particularly political. So I knew in advance that was going to happen. The Republicans were going to do it. You know, they were going to take control. It was going to happen. All the exit polls, this, that, and the other, and people were telling me early on election night. And I went to the news management and said, "Hey, you know, we can break this story. This is going to happen. It's going to be historic."
Yeah.
And not only did they not want to report it, they eventually were forced to, but they wouldn't allow me to report it because they knew that, because they resented me as a conservative, and they felt like that I would take, I don't know, too much glee in the fact that it had happened, which I wouldn't have, but they tried to not report it, and then they wanted it reported by someone from a point of view that was going to come from a point of view of how terrible this is going to be, that the Republicans and not the Democrats are going to be in control of Congress.
Back when they were still under the wraps with under the covers with it, they're still hiding it, right, under their breath. Now they're just out in the open about it. They just don't care.
Yeah, but here's the thing that I have to say about that, and this is part of my journey through up into starting the foundation. We got to this point in America, no matter who's been in control of Congress or who's been in control of the White House. We've gotten to this. The government has grown. The national debt has grown. Our freedoms have been eroded. Income taxes have increased. Social programs and spending on social programs that don't work continue unabated, no matter who's been in control. So I think it's a system-wide problem that, by and large, no matter if you have an R or a D, are responsible for. And I think that also speaks to, pardon me, what has become a political class in this country, whether it's Republican, Independent, or Democrat. There are people there that are professional politicians, and they are every 2 years or every 7 years they are on the election bandwagon out there, you know, trying to gin up votes and say what people want to hear in order to get elected. And that's what they do. And then they just turn their back on that to a large degree. Every decision, and there are exceptions to this, of course, but by and large, I think that every decision that a sitting elected official makes is through the prism of, how is this decision going to affect my re-election possibilities or chances? And they make decisions based on that.
Well, you know, Mike, I couldn't agree with you more. It goes back to that meme where it says there's, you know, monkeys are in a cage, and there's but I'm going to get it kind of wrong, but you'll probably remember the story. You know, there's a banana at the top of the ladder, and you know the new monkey comes in and tries to get it. All the other monkeys beat him up, and you know, and then every time there's a new monkey, they beat the new monkey up, and none of them know why, but they get swallowed up into the system of that's just what you do when
beat up the monkey.
When the new monkey tries to get the banana.
Right.
And it's no different than I think what happens to most elected officials, and the ones who remain on our side, you know, they kind of keep them in the closet. They're kind of like, oh yeah, that's that guy over there. He's doing a great job. Put him in the closet. You know.
Yeah, but see, also what has happened here, though, and this has become part of the problem, that in addition to traditional progressives and traditional uh, liberals. We now have on both sides of the consensus the lunatic fringe people,
Hmm.
and they're ruling the day because they're vocal and they get a lot of media attention because they make ratings. It's like, the mainstream media made Donald Trump because he was good ratings for them.
Right.
They didn't care what he was saying or what he was a Republican, for goodness sake. He didn't fit, but he brought the eyes to the screen, and that's what they did. They acquiesced to that and gave him billions of dollars in free advertising. You
I
know,
always say it's the far right and the far left that's divided us up.
yeah.
While we're talking about division, we start wrapping up here in a minute. And one of my favorite questions that I like to ask everybody, before I ask you if there's anything else that you want to include or talk about, one of the things I like to ask people is what unites us, Mike, as Americans. What unites us as Americans? Whether we're a Republican, Democrat, what brings us together?
Okay. Do we have a minute to answer that?
Absolutely. That's why I make sure we.
See, I think that the the answer to that question historically is uh, being lost because of the cultural breakdown and the things that we traditionally have held dear in this country, and what it means to be an American, what it means to become an American is no longer what it used to be. There's no longer the influence on learning the language, on being a part of the culture. You bring your culture with you, it's there, but you embrace a new culture and move forward with it. You don't try to bring your country and your culture to a certain part of one of the boroughs in New York and say this is going to be little so and so.
The way
I
it
mean,
is. Yeah.
yeah, or certain parts of Paris. As this is going to be so and so. It used to be that there was a pride in becoming an American. Now, yes, we are made up of immigrants, no doubt about it, and there were immigrant enclaves in the big cities in America. But there was that American dream thing that people engaged in, embraced, that brought about wonderful things in this culture, in our society, that we're now using freedom to destroy.
Hmm.
So, what unites us uh, depends on who you are in America today. What unites traditional Americans, like you and I, are the same things that did 40 years ago. Truth, justice, the American way, the great things of Western civilization, the heritage, the literature, the culture, the art,
Hmm.
all of those things that go to make up what is Western civilization. That's what we cherish. The Constitution. I mean, there those numbers are less, and I think they're decreasing every day. Just like the number of people who profess to be Christians is not just decreasing, as I mentioned earlier, in the UK, but in this country as well. We're losing those people, and it's all part of insidious, relentless method and design to destroy the freedom in this country and to create what I believe. And I'm once again not a white right wing nut sort of guy. I try to be pretty methodical and try to think the best that I can. But I think it's all in the design to ultimately create a one world government to a
Yeah.
large degree. And I think, if you look at it, America is the only thing that's really standing in the way of that around the globe. If America really does fall, traditional America, then the United Nations is there with a whole bureaucracy, with an army, with an economy, and a control mechanism in countries around the world to pick up the ball and say, okay, here's your one world government.
Right. Exactly. And once that's put in place, we're
Freedom goes away.
yeah, we're history, right? And what's interesting is how many people think that's a conspiracy.
Oh, I know.
I mean,
But see, that's what the left has been able to do by having control of the mechanisms of power and influence, the media and the news media and the cultural influences as well in movies and pictures and TV series and things of that nature. They're, uh, they've taken control of the image making, the concept, the thinking process, and it's textbook socialism. That's the thing. But once again, they have the educational system,
mhm.
so we as a country are not taught the dangers of that and the greatness of what we have that they're trying to destroy.
Instead, they try to make us feel real comfortable with government, our taxes raising, the way things are going, the direct way they make us feel really comfortable about where it's going, that we still going to have our freedom because we have a sense of freedom. We can still start our car when we want to start it. Oh, except if you're in California sometimes. We can still go where we want to go. Oh, it's only if it's an electric car. Well, that's okay. I get to choose the electric car that I want, right? Well, for now, so we don't really see it, but it's amazing how many smart people that I know are saying, oh, that's all the conspiracy thinking. And while I like to say, look, you might think it's conspiracy. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. It's not that as much as it needs to be on everybody's radar, whether you can agree with it or not. Everybody needs to be aware of it because if it gets to that point where it tips the scale a little bit more, the people who were paying attention, maybe they didn't believe in it. Maybe at that point they go, "Wow, this is what they're talking about." Kind of like all the elections colluding that we're hearing about with all the Twitter dumps right now. Now we're finding out that there really was collusion with the media. That a lot of people thought that was conspiracy theory thinking. I'm not so far into it, that I say this is what is going on, but I'm aware enough of all of it. I like to talk about it because the more we know about that, the more we can fix other problems in our society at the very least.
Right. But the thing that we have to, as conservatives, classical conservatives, what we have to do is make sure that we're bringing the right solutions to the table, and that we're doing it in a way that people will respond to and not
Right.
reject. I did some communication consulting, as I mentioned, on with some non-governmental organizations and with members of Congress. And this was back early on before um, conservatives really embraced the media and really started to understand
Right.
how to use it. The basic attitude was by conservatives, whether it's NGOs or elected officials or staff of congressmen or senators, representatives or senators, is their basic attitude was, I'm right. I know I'm right, and if you knew what I was right, you would know I was right too. And
Exactly.
and I kept saying, wait a minute, guys. East of the Potomac River, you write stuff and say stuff that communicates real well with elected officials and lobbyists and lawyers, media people. Uh, but you wonder why your message gets lost when it goes west of the Potomac River. And I said, the reason why, and the left has been beating us to death with this for 3 decades at least, is you don't get any kind of emotional buy-in. You think emotion is beneath you. But the emotion of any message is what drives the intellectual heft of it. You can't have just, here are the facts, ma'am, and expect people between the coasts, let's say,
That's right.
to get it. You gotta reach them where they live.
Mike,
You gotta tell a story. You gotta factor in how they're gonna respond to
Mike,
this.
you hit on here, and we're gonna have to start wrapping up with this last final thought. I have another guest coming on at 6:30.
Okay.
That I want to make sure everybody stay around for at 6:30 here on Facebook and Cloud Hub. You'll see the next guest. But the thing that you're hitting on is that passion, that emotion that you referred to, is used for something, but it's also used against something. And what the politicians are doing is, they are tempering their passion, when they don't want to inflame people or motivate people to come out against them or what they're doing. And then they use that passion or that passion to motivate people when they need to motivate them to help drive the narrative or the ideology in the direction they need it to be able to get done what they need to get done. So we're actually being controlled with those passions and with that to be motivated one way or the other.
Yeah, we are. And that's why we have to be an informed electorate, an informed populist in order
So
to discriminate against those kind of manipulations.
so we know. So if we're informed and we have that basic knowledge that they're trying, that way of thinking, if you will, that critical thinking skill to be able to be aware of when to allow them to motivate us and when to subdue our passions in a way that we stay more temperate. Temperate, is that the right word for it?
Temperate, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we have to do that to interpret what they're saying and process it. But I think equally, if not more so importantly, is we have to hold those folks' feet to the fire of what they said they were elected for,
That's
and
right.
and instill in them that, hey, we're watching. We want traditional American values. And we're not talking about discrimination. We're not talking about racism. We're not talking about excluding people. We want to include as many people as possible into this wonderful experiment that is so precious and is so vulnerable called freedom. The majority of time, as we talked earlier, of people who lived on this planet have not been free the
And
majority of the time.
and right now they're dividing up our freedoms to control us.
That's true, and we have to be aware of that, but we have to do it in as intelligent and calm and convincing manner as possible, and not be demonized, ridiculed, not give them the opportunity to call us the lunatic fringe nutcases.
Mike, thank you so much for all your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed talking with you. Thank
How
you,
can people
and
find
visiting
out?
with your watchers and viewers and listeners.
Well, we get and people will be able to listen to this again on all podcast apps after I put it on my podcast platform. They're going to be able to watch it again on either Cloud Hub or Rumble. I occasionally put things up on YouTube. Sometimes they censor me. But how can people find out more about you? Where do they go to find out more about you?
Well, you can go to saveamericasfreedom.org with the caveat that it's kind of dormant now, that we're gearing up to get it going again. And also, I don't have it now, but I can share it with you later. The place to go to check out my book, Memphis.
We'll do another interview on that, Mike.
Okay, I look forward to that, William. Thank you.
Mike, thank you very much for your time. I'm in the broadcast, and if you just hang on 1 second, I'll talk to you after we end the broadcast. Everybody else, in about 10 minutes coming up, we've got our next interview. It's one that you'll be very excited to hear. Another one. We got 3 good ones tonight. Mike was the first one. 2 more to go. Stay tuned. Thank you so much for listening to me, William Wallace, for America.